They fined me for fishing and hung a $200 notice on my door. I paid, walked away, but I never forgot. So I bought the lake they owned, changed the rules, and watched an entire neighborhood implode. Stay till the end to see how one fine turned into ultimate revenge. Before we dive in, tell me in the comments, what country are you watching from? I really want to know how far this story travels and where my viewers are tuning in from. It began like any other quiet morning in Willow Creek, a community so peaceful it almost felt fake. The lake shimmered under the golden sunrise, its still waters reflecting the perfect image of the suburban dream. White fences, manicured lawns, and an HOA board that treated the neighborhood like their personal kingdom. For me, that lake wasn't just decoration. It was my childhood. I'd learned to fish there with my dad, caught my first bass, and found peace in its calm reflection after long, brutal days at work. But the HOA didn't care about memories. They cared about control. That morning, as I stood by the water with my old fishing rod, I heard the familiar sound of heels clicking on the wooden deck. Karen, the self-appointed queen of Willow Creek HOA, marched toward me, clutching her clipboard like it was a weapon. She didn't even look at the lake, only at me. Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd never been told no. By noon, I had a fine in my mailbox. $200 for unauthorized fishing activity on HOA property. No warning. No discussion. Just punishment. At first, I laughed. Then I realized they were serious. The HOA bylaws, written decades ago, classified the lake as community property, meaning only board-approved activities were allowed. Fishing wasn't one of them. Apparently, the lake was decorative, not recreational. Over the next few weeks, they made sure I never forgot it. They sent letters, added late fees, and even threatened legal action if I continued to violate community harmony. All for catching a few fish. I paid the fine, but something inside me shifted that day. It wasn't about the money. It was about pride. About how far people like Karen would go to feel powerful. I began to notice other things, how they bullied older residents about lawn colors, fined families for having unauthorized garden furniture, and dictated what kind of mailbox people could own. The HOA had become a regime. But the lake, that was personal. That night, as I sat staring at the water from my porch, I made myself a silent promise. They could control everything else, but they would never control my lake. From that moment on, I started researching land rights, ownership boundaries, county maps. What I discovered next would change everything. The HOA didn't actually own the lake. It sat on private land, land that technically belonged to the family of the original developer. The HOA leased it under a long-term agreement that was about to expire. And that was the moment I realized? I could take it all. A plan began forming in my mind. Slow, deliberate, unstoppable. I wasn't just going to fish again. I was going to own the lake they tried to keep me away from. It started with a phone call. A quiet one, the kind you don't tell anyone about until it's too late to stop. I'd spent weeks digging through dusty county records, tracing ownership lines like a detective following a trail of old paper ghosts. Every document pointed back to one name, Harold Beckett, the last surviving member of the developer's family. Harold lived 2 towns over, tucked away in a quiet farmhouse far from the polished streets of Willow Creek. The man was nearly 80, his voice raspy, his mind still sharp. When I mentioned the lake, there was a long pause on the other end. Then a soft chuckle. He remembered that lake better than anyone. He'd built it with his father's hands before the HOA ever existed. And when I told him what they'd turned it into, a decorative prison, he said something that made my heart race. He said he was tired of dealing with the HOA's paperwork, tired of their constant demands for lease extensions and maintenance approvals. He was thinking of selling the land. Right then, I knew this was my chance. I played it carefully. No flashy moves, no open offers. The HOA couldn't know what I was doing. If they caught wind, they'd swoop in with their lawyers and bury me under red tape. So I approached it like a covert mission. Private meetings. Cash offers. Silent signatures. Weeks passed. While the HOA hosted their usual board meetings and barbecues, I was quietly assembling the biggest check I'd ever written in my life. My savings, my late father's inheritance, and even a small business loan, all poured into one purpose. And then, one crisp morning, it happened. The papers were signed. The deed transferred. The lake, my lake, was now mine. For the first time in decades, it belonged to someone who actually respected it. Not as decoration, not as leverage, but as a living part of the land. But I didn't tell anyone. Not yet. I wanted them to keep thinking they were in charge. I wanted to watch the smug looks on their faces when the truth finally hit. In the following days, the HOA sent out their usual monthly bulletin, reminders about lawn height, pet policies, and of course, the no fishing rule. I smiled reading it. That rule was about to become a monument to their own arrogance. I began by visiting the county office. Quietly, I had the lake's status changed from community access to private property. It took one signature and a small administrative fee. Simple. Clean. Official. From there, I installed new signage, nothing dramatic at first. Just a few small notices around the perimeter reading: private property. No trespassing. By the time the HOA noticed, it was too late. Karen showed up at my driveway with her usual fury, waving papers and yelling about community rights. I didn't say a word. I just handed her a copy of the deed, my name, in bold ink, stamped and sealed by the county. Her face went pale. The news spread faster than wildfire. Within hours, the neighborhood group chat exploded. Screenshots of the deed, speculation, panic, disbelief. How could one man buy the lake? How could they let it happen? The HOA called an emergency meeting that same evening. I didn't attend. I sat on my porch, listening to the distant echoes of raised voices and slammed doors. They could debate all they wanted, it didn't change the truth. I now owned the one thing they couldn't control. But ownership wasn't enough. Not after what they'd done. Not after the humiliation, the fines, the threats. I wasn't looking for revenge just to feel powerful, I wanted them to understand what power really meant. So I did what they'd done to me. I started sending letters. Effective immediately, access to the lake is restricted to authorized individuals only. Unauthorized use will result in trespassing citations. And at the bottom of every letter, I added a note. Fishing is now fully permitted, for the owner. The irony was delicious. The same HOA that once fined me for fishing now lived in fear of stepping near the water. Over the next week, they tried everything: lawyers, appeals, petitions. But the paperwork was airtight. The county backed me up. Harold's sale was legitimate. The HOA had no claim. The once decorative lake now stood behind new signs, a silent mirror reflecting their defeat. Families who used to walk their dogs by the shore avoided it now, embarrassed and angry. And Karen, well, Karen wasn't done yet. Late one evening, I saw her car idling by the waterline. She sat there for nearly an hour, staring at the lake like it had betrayed her. She wasn't the type to lose gracefully. I could feel it, this wasn't over. She would come back harder, louder, and more desperate than ever. And when she did, I'd be ready. Because the lake wasn't just mine now. It was my battlefield. The silence didn't last long. It never does in a neighborhood run by people who crave control. By the end of that week, Karen's anger had evolved from disbelief to full-scale warfare. It began with the flyers. Every doorstep in Willow Creek had one: protect our community lake, stop illegal takeover. They were printed on glossy paper, plastered with dramatic headlines and bold red fonts. To the casual reader, it looked like I'd stolen the lake, not legally bought it. Karen's weapon wasn't truth, it was outrage. By Monday morning, the gossip machine was running at full speed. My neighbors, people who'd waved to me for years, started looking away when I passed. A few whispered as I walked my dog. Others, more bold, left snide comments on the neighborhood forum. According to Karen's narrative, I was a greedy troublemaker who'd hijacked community property for personal gain. The HOA board backed her up, of course. They posted statements about legal consultations and pending action. But I knew the truth. And more importantly, I had the paperwork to prove it. Still, I didn't fight back. Not yet. There's a certain power in patience, in letting your opponent believe they're winning while they dig their own hole. Behind the scenes, I started preparing for what I knew was coming: a legal assault. I hired a property lawyer, gathered every document, and recorded every word that came out of Karen's mouth. And sure enough, 2 weeks later, I received an official-looking envelope. Inside, a notice of violation, from the HOA itself. They claimed I was operating an unapproved private facility and disrupting community harmony. The fine? $5,000. They'd done it again. I laughed out loud. Then, instead of reacting with rage, I did something unexpected. I invited the county inspector to come take a look. He arrived, clipboard in hand, and after a quick review, his response was simple: this property is privately owned. HOA regulations don't apply here. That one sentence shattered their case. When word reached the HOA board, chaos followed. Their community meeting turned into a shouting match. Homeowners started questioning why their fees were being spent on lawsuits instead of maintenance. The illusion of control was cracking, and Karen could feel it slipping through her fingers. So she went for the nuclear option. One evening, as the sun set over the water, I saw movement near the lake. Flashlights. 3 figures sneaking along the bank, pulling something from a truck. When I walked closer, I realized what they were doing: putting up their own signs. HOA property, access restricted. They were trying to reclaim the lake by force, ignoring every legal boundary that existed. I pulled out my phone, recorded everything, and called the sheriff. The deputies arrived fast. They took one look at my deed, another at the HOA members trespassing on private land, and that was that. Karen was furious. She argued, yelled, and tried to twist the story. But the law was clear: she was trespassing. The deputies escorted her off the property, and that night, the entire neighborhood watched as the self-proclaimed queen of Willow Creek HOA was forced to leave in humiliation. You'd think that would have been the end of it. But people like Karen don't stop when they lose power, they reinvent it. The next morning, she started a campaign online. She called herself a community advocate, rallying other HOA leaders from nearby suburbs. She accused me of destroying shared beauty for personal ego. It went viral in the local Facebook groups. But what she didn't realize was that her obsession was destroying her reputation faster than I ever could. Neighbors began seeing through the lies. They remembered the petty fines, the bullying, the endless control. People started quitting the HOA board. Others refused to pay their fees. Within a month, the organization that had ruled Willow Creek for years was falling apart from the inside. Meanwhile, I continued restoring the lake. I cleaned the banks, repaired the old dock, and planted new trees along the waterline. It became beautiful again, peaceful, alive. The sound of frogs at night replaced the noise of HOA meetings. One evening, as I sat by the water, I saw something unexpected: families walking by. Not sneaking, not complaining, just walking quietly, admiring the sunset. A few nodded to me. One even said thank you. That's when I realized something: this wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about taking back peace. But peace has a way of attracting envy. Karen wasn't finished. She had one last move, the kind that could destroy everything I'd built. A secret she'd been holding back, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And that moment was coming soon. For a few short weeks, the neighborhood seemed quieter. The HOA's presence had faded, and Karen had retreated into the shadows, nursing her wounded pride. The lake glistened again, calm and alive, as if it had finally taken a breath after years of suffocation. But silence, I've learned, is rarely peace. Sometimes, it's just the calm before the next storm. The first hint of trouble came wrapped in an envelope, thick paper, embossed seal, no return address. Inside, a letter from a law firm I didn't recognize. The tone was polite, but the message was venomous. This correspondence concerns a reversionary clause attached to parcel #L142, hereafter referred to as Willow Creek Lake. My stomach sank. A reversionary clause, a fancy legal term meaning that under certain conditions, property rights could revert to a previous owner or entity. I'd studied every document before buying the lake. There hadn't been any mention of such a clause. But Karen had found something. According to the letter, decades ago, before the HOA even existed, the original developer had inserted a conditional clause stating that if the lake's ownership ever changed hands, the HOA would have the first right to reclaim the property for community preservation. It was an old, outdated, practically forgotten clause, but still legally binding. And somehow, Karen had gotten her hands on it. It was her revenge. The weapon she'd been waiting to use. Within days, the HOA reactivated. The same people who'd resigned were suddenly back, claiming they'd been misled. Karen, of course, was back at the helm, waving that clause like a royal decree. She'd filed an injunction with the county court, demanding an immediate suspension of my property rights until the clause was reviewed. For the first time since this war began, I felt the ground shift beneath me. My lawyer was confident: the clause was ancient, vague, and likely unenforceable, but the legal process would take months. In the meantime, the court ordered a temporary freeze on any changes or modifications to the property. It meant no improvements. No access. No fishing. Once again, I was locked out of my own lake. Karen celebrated like she'd won the war. She called a neighborhood meeting, stood at the front of the clubhouse, and spoke like she was delivering a victory speech. Residents clapped. Cameras flashed. For the first time in weeks, she looked alive again. But victory built on deceit doesn't last long. Because while she was busy celebrating, I was digging deeper. Late nights turned into early mornings as I sifted through every file, every archive, every public record I could find. I spent hours at the county office, flipping through dusty folders that hadn't been opened in decades. And then, I found it. A single, overlooked amendment, buried in the legal history of the original development plan. It was dated 15 years after the clause Karen had found. A legal update signed by Harold Beckett's father himself. It stated clearly that any reversionary or community rights clauses shall be considered null upon transfer of direct ownership to a private individual not affiliated with Willow Creek HOA. That was me. In one line of old legal text, the entire foundation of Karen's revenge crumbled. But I didn't tell her. Not yet. I wanted her to play out her victory. To believe she'd won. So when the next HOA meeting was announced, I showed up. The room was full, curious faces, smug smiles, a crowd eager for drama. Karen stood front and center, savoring the attention. She began with her usual speech about justice and community preservation. Then she turned to me, smiling like a predator who thought her prey had given up. When she asked if I had anything to say, I handed her a folder. Inside were copies of the amendment, notarized, certified, and freshly validated by the county clerk. She scanned the papers. Her confident smile faltered. Her eyes darted across the text, desperate to find a loophole, but there wasn't one. The words were crystal clear. The clause she had built her entire campaign on was void. The room fell silent. You could hear the air leave her lungs. Then came the whispers, quiet at first, then louder. The same people who had cheered her on now questioned her judgment. Someone even laughed. Karen stood frozen, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the folder. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. By the next morning, the injunction was lifted. The court dismissed the HOA's claim. And just like that, the lake was mine again, untouchable, undisputed, and free. But something had changed. The victory didn't feel like triumph anymore. It felt heavy. The neighborhood was fractured. Friends had turned on each other. Lines were drawn not over property, but over pride. And while I'd won, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, deep down, I'd lost something too. Still, Karen wasn't finished. She never would be. I could see it in her eyes that night as she drove past my house, slow, silent, the headlights cutting across the lake's reflection. She wasn't fighting for control anymore. She was fighting for revenge. And her next move would go beyond property lines. By the time autumn rolled in, Willow Creek didn't feel like the same neighborhood anymore. The air was colder, quieter, and tense, like the calm before a storm you can feel but can't yet see. The leaves floated across the lake, forming a golden layer that shimmered under the pale afternoon sun. It should have been peaceful. But peace doesn't exist where pride still burns. Karen had lost the legal battle, but she hadn't lost her obsession. The HOA was fractured, half the members had quit, homeowners were questioning their dues, and meetings were being cancelled for lack of quorum. But Karen refused to accept defeat. She started working in the shadows. Late at night, her car lights would flash across the cul-de-sac, parking near the clubhouse for hours. Strange deliveries arrived at her house, boxes, folders, office supplies. She was building something again. Something new. At first, I ignored it. I was tired of the fight. Owning the lake had brought me the satisfaction I wanted, but the thrill was gone. I just wanted to live quietly, to fish, to breathe, to move on. But Karen didn't want quiet. She wanted revenge that everyone could see. It began with a rumor. Someone posted on the neighborhood forum that the county was investigating environmental violations near the lake, illegal dumping, contamination, unauthorized construction. The post spread fast. My name was mentioned. The HOA, of course, claimed they were concerned citizens. Then came the inspectors. 2 men in reflective vests showed up one morning with clipboards and cameras, saying they'd received anonymous complaints. They combed through my property, tested the water, and took pictures of my dock. Nothing was found. But the message was clear: Karen had turned to bureaucracy again. Next came the signs. Dozens of them appeared overnight, staked in lawns and along the sidewalks. Save our lake. Stop the destruction. Say no to greedy landowners. It was a smear campaign, and it was working. People who'd once supported me were now confused, unsure, whispering about what was true. That's what Karen was best at, creating doubt. Then came the county hearing notice. Karen had filed a formal complaint with the Environmental Review Board, accusing me of altering a natural habitat without permits. It was a clever move. Even if it didn't hold up legally, it would drag me through weeks of hearings, paperwork, and stress. I sat in that hearing room surrounded by county officials, HOA members, and curious residents. Karen sat in the front row, perfectly dressed, her expression calm but her eyes sharp with satisfaction. She spoke for 20 minutes straight, painting me as a reckless property owner destroying their lake. But she made one mistake. She brought up photos, supposedly showing recent damage to the shoreline. Photos taken from angles only visible from inside my private dock area. In her hunger to prove me guilty, she had accidentally admitted to trespassing again. My lawyer caught it instantly. He presented the security footage I'd quietly installed weeks earlier, showing Karen and 2 HOA board members sneaking through the back gate at dawn with a camera. The boardroom fell silent. The county dismissed the complaint immediately. But more than that, They filed a warning against the HOA for falsifying reports. It was the kind of public embarrassment that ends careers, and for Karen, her reputation shattered in real time. Neighbors began turning against her. The HOA's social media pages went dark. Their lawyer quit. The few loyal members she had left stopped showing up at meetings. She was alone. That evening, I walked down to the lake. The air was cool, and the water reflected the orange glow of the sunset. I thought maybe, finally, it was over. But across the water, I saw her. Karen stood near the old boardwalk, clutching her clipboard like a relic of a lost empire. She stared at the lake in silence, her reflection rippling in the water. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, without warning, she hurled the clipboard into the lake. It hit the surface with a hollow splash, sending small ripples toward my side of the shore. That was the moment I realized something I hadn't before: this wasn't about property anymore. For Karen, it was personal. The HOA wasn't just power, it was her identity. And now, stripped of that control, she had nothing left. I should have felt victorious. But what I felt was something closer to pity. The next day, the HOA officially dissolved. The residents voted it out. Karen didn't attend the meeting. She'd lost everything: the board, the power, the illusion of control. But the story didn't end there. Because even when systems collapse, people like her always find a way to rise again, in whispers, in rumors, in shadows. A week later, I received another letter. This time, not from a lawyer or an HOA, but from the county's zoning department. It was a simple notice. A new application has been filed requesting commercial development near Willow Creek Lake. And the name listed on the application was one I knew all too well: Karen M. Douglas. She was planning to build, not a park, not a home, but a fishing club. The same woman who once fined me for casting a line was now trying to profit from the very thing she'd banned. It wasn't just revenge anymore. It was war, and this time, the battlefield wasn't the HOA. It was business. When the letter arrived, I almost laughed. Karen, the same woman who once fined me for fishing, was now trying to build a fishing club right next to the lake I owned. It was so ironic it felt scripted, like the universe itself was mocking her. But beneath the humor was a familiar chill. I knew this wasn't just business. This was her last strike, the final attempt to rewrite her humiliation. I drove to the county office the next morning. The development application was public record. And there it was, a sleek, overpolished proposal titled Willow Creek Sportsman's Club. Renderings showed boardwalks, rental boats, bait shops, all centered around my lake. Except, she didn't own the land. Her plan relied on one key assumption: that she'd get a commercial access easement through my property. She thought the county would grant it automatically. After all, she still believed the lake was community connected. She was wrong. I met with the zoning board that same afternoon, paperwork in hand, the deed, the legal maps, every updated record showing that the lake was private property, with no public or commercial access routes. The board members reviewed it silently, their pens hovering over the documents like judges delivering a quiet sentence. Finally, the chairman looked up. The proposal cannot proceed without the landowner's approval. I didn't say much, just smiled, signed the objection form, and walked out. By the time Karen found out, her investors had already started backing out. She'd borrowed money to file permits, pay architects, even advertise her upcoming fishing resort. And now, the project was dead before it even began. But she didn't give up quietly. She started visiting the county office daily, arguing, appealing, begging for reconsideration. When that failed, she turned to the media, small local blogs, community pages, anywhere she could spin the story. She painted herself as the victim of a vindictive property owner abusing loopholes to destroy community growth. It was a desperate performance, and the world could see it. The same neighbors who once feared her now laughed at her posts. The same people she'd fined for trivial reasons now commented with sarcasm and memes. Her power had turned into a punchline. Still, part of me couldn't let it end like that. Not because she deserved mercy, but because I deserved closure. So I invited her. A handwritten note. Simple, direct. Meet me at the lake. One last time. She came at sunset. The sky was painted in hues of orange and crimson, the kind of scene that makes you forget for a second how ugly people can be. She stood on the same dock where she'd once screamed at me for fishing. This time, she was quiet. No clipboard. No lawyer. Just silence and bitterness. I told her I wasn't there to gloat. I told her that everything she'd done, every fine, every threat, every humiliation, had built the very downfall she was living through. I told her the truth she'd never faced: control isn't leadership, and fear isn't respect. She didn't respond. Her eyes stayed fixed on the water, glassy and distant. For a moment, I saw the faint reflection of who she used to be, a woman who'd built her life on rules because rules made her feel safe. And now, stripped of them, she looked lost. After a long silence, she turned to leave. But before she did, I said one last thing, something that wasn't about revenge, or victory, or punishment. The lake's open. Not for business. Not for power. For peace. She paused, but didn't turn back. Then she walked away, slowly, quietly, and disappeared into the fading light. I never saw her again. Weeks later, a moving truck appeared in front of her house. She sold the property and left Willow Creek for good. No one knew where she went. No one asked. The HOA files were boxed up and tossed out. Her name vanished from every record. And as for me, life went on. The lake became a sanctuary again. Families came to picnic, kids fished off the dock, the air filled with laughter instead of rules. I let people enjoy it, freely, without fines or regulations. No one abused it. No one fought. Because when ownership is built on respect instead of control, peace maintains itself. Sometimes, I sit on the dock at dusk, the same spot where this war began. The water ripples softly, reflecting the world like a mirror, calm, forgiving, endless. I think about how far I came from that first fine, and how a petty act of control spiraled into something so much bigger than either of us imagined. And every time I cast my fishing line, I remember the lesson that started it all. If you try to own power through fear, it will own you back. The lake doesn't belong to me anymore, not really. It belongs to everyone who remembers what it cost to make it free again. As the last bit of sunlight fades, I reel in the line slowly, smiling to myself. Some catches aren't about the fish. They're about the fight that taught you who you really are. The morning after the HOA's final meeting felt different. The air around Willow Creek was no longer filled with the smug confidence of people who thought they controlled everything. The once busy streets were silent, the kind of silence that hangs after a storm, uneasy, tense, and heavy with realization. From my porch overlooking the water, I watched the sun rise over the lake that was finally, completely, mine. It had been months since the chaos began. The HOA had fought, screamed, threatened, and even tried to petition the county to revoke my ownership. But paperwork speaks louder than gossip, and the deed was already in my name. Every inch of that lake, from the rippling surface to the mud at the bottom, belonged to me now. The same Karen who once fined me for casting a fishing line couldn't even step near the shore without my permission. She had to watch from behind her perfect white fence as I restored what she once called a decorative feature back into what it was always meant to be, a place of life, peace, and freedom. But I didn't stop there. I cleaned the lake, installed wooden docks, built small cabins along the edges, and opened it as a private fishing retreat. Families from outside the neighborhood came to fish, camp, and watch sunsets over the water. I called it Fisher's Haven. Word spread quickly. The HOA couldn't stop it, because they had no authority anymore. Their power ended where my property began. Soon, the same people who once mocked me began asking if they could visit. Some even apologized, trying to earn my goodwill. But I remembered every letter, every threat, every insult they'd thrown when I was just a man with a fishing rod. So I told them the truth, the lake was closed to HOA members. The look on their faces, disbelief turning to regret, was the moment I realized I had truly won. Not out of revenge, but out of justice. The kind of justice that comes when arrogance finally meets its limit. Over time, the HOA started crumbling. Without the lake to anchor their prestige, home values dropped. Residents began questioning Karen's leadership. The meetings that once drew crowds now ended in shouting matches and resignations. The perfect community was falling apart, not because of me, but because of the pride that once blinded them. And through it all, I stayed quiet. Every morning, I'd take my old fishing rod, the same one I used the day I was fined, and sit by the lake. The same water, the same peace, but this time, it was on my terms. The ripples of that decision reached far beyond Willow Creek. People online shared my story. The man who bought the lake to get back at his HOA, it became legend. But for me, it wasn't about fame. It was about reclaiming something no one had the right to take, my freedom. As the sun dipped low one evening, I looked across the lake and saw Karen standing at the fence. For a brief moment, she wasn't the tyrant of the HOA. She was just another person staring at something she used to control and realizing it was gone forever. I gave her a nod, not out of kindness, but closure. Then I cast my line into the water, watching the ripples expand, catching the last light of day. The neighborhood behind me might crumble, new people might move in, new rules might come, but this lake would always tell the story. Of a man who refused to be controlled. Of a fine that turned into a fortune. Of a fight that turned into freedom. The HOA fined me for fishing. So I bought the lake. And I banned the entire neighborhood. Forever.